West Hill United is a progressive spiritual community where how you live is more important than what you believe. West Hill United is a people, a place, an idea. We are a community living out of a progressive faith, striving to make a positive difference in our own lives, the lives of others, and the world. Join us Sundays at 10:30 a.m. or connect with us at any time.
We would like to begin today by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and was previously occupied by the Huron-Wendat and Seneca First Nations. This land is covered by the Treaty 20 and the Williams Treaties of 1923 and lies within the lands of the protected Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement of 1701. An Indigenous citizenship law made between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations that extends from Montreal to Fort Erie. One of the core values within the idea of a dish with one spoon is that those who use the land should not abuse the land. Individuals and groups should only take what they need from the land so that there will be a healthy, long-term, sustainable environment. All participants in the agreement or treaty had the responsibility to ensure that the dish would never be empty by taking care of the land and all of the living beings on it. A couple of weeks ago, I spoke to you about the sad fact that of the 94 calls to action from the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission, regrettably, only 14 of those calls to action have been completed to date. 15 calls have not even been started yet. 19 calls to action have been stalled, and there are 46 calls to action in progress. And so again, I want to say, let us not be overwhelmed and instead ask ourselves, what as individuals can we do? There are over 600 Indigenous nonprofits you can support across Canada. Now, for instance, there are two branches of the Aboriginal Housing Support Centre in Scarborough, one in the southwest and the other in the northeast. However, if you are unable to give personal time to a charity, another choice might be Inspire, which is a national charity which believes that the Indigenous education is Canada's future, and they would welcome donations or whatever type of help you could give. Once more, there are 600 Indigenous nonprofits in Canada, and I invite you to find one that speaks to you and reach out your support however you are able. Again, a warm welcome to everyone here in the room, on Zoom, across Toronto, Ontario, Canada, United Kingdom, and beyond. We're delighted to have you with us. Please enjoy the service. We have two readings this morning from Richard Katz's book, Indigenous Healing Psychology. Richard Katz is a professor emeritus at First Nations University in Regina and an adjunct professor at the University of Saskatchewan. The first reading is Problems to be Fixed Rather than Potential to be Fulfilled. Katz begins. Mainstream psychology focuses on human and social problems and pathologies and how to fix them, or in a more positive vein, how to make things better. The clinical fields are psychology's most popular professional pathways, exerting a large influence on what is researched and studied, and their primary clinical expertise is in dealing with neuroses and psychoses rather than growth and actualization. Katz goes on to say, but there are three important consequences of psychology's emphasis on problems and pathologies. First, psychology is committed to finding something that is broken in order to fix it or make it better. Personal neuroses and social dysfunctions are targeted. In the effort to find worthy subjects to work on, there is a second consequence, medicalization. Ordinary life issues and challenges are labeled as medical problems or mental illnesses and therefore must be fixed, and fixed by the appropriate professional, namely a psychologist or other mental health worker. A third consequence of this focus on problems and pathologies is that psychology overlooks enormous areas of human potential. Certainly, dealing with life's challenges, including those severe enough to become mental illnesses, is a necessary element of such growth and development. But when psychology emphasizes fixing problems, the creative potential in human development becomes an afterthought. And the second reading from his book is titled Our First Psychologists. We all have our roots in Indigenous peoples or the first peoples to inhabit the different parts of the earth. We all come from a place first inhabited by our distant ancestors, who lived primarily as hunters and gatherers. As these first people gather together, they engage in the human concerns of community, building interpersonal relations, and spiritual understanding. Being human means to ponder the meaning of their lives and the lives of others. Without that self-reflection and delving into the meaning of their existence, survival is not possible. These first people of the various lands engage in the defining concerns of psychology. As such, they are our first psychologists. Within Indigenous cultures, these first psychologists are more accurately considered healers or elders. Psychology and psychologists are terms emanating largely from a particular historical and Western cultural context, and are thereby connected to a particular set of roles and functions. Indigenous healers and elders perform roles and functions that overlap sufficiently with that particular Western-oriented set to also be considered as psychologists. But most importantly, since elders and healers' roles and functions go beyond those of the conventional psychologists, they can offer insights into enhancing that conventional approach. These Indigenous knowledge keepers are not psychologists as defined by some contemporary professional accrediting body, but psychologists as validated by the tasks and challenges of living well. Though typically not labeled as psychologists, these Indigenous elders and healers are living and doing psychology. As Ratu Sivu put it ever so simply, quote, "We try to understand our world. That's just what we do," end of quote. These Indigenous elders and healers, whose voices are ignored or disregarded within mainstream psychology, can offer a key to our search for ways toward what can be healing psychology. Offered as wisdom for the journey. May we walk in its light. This time it's my pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker, Dr. Nate Charach. Dr. Charach is a psychiatrist working in Toronto. Over the last couple of years, he has started psychiatry groups, a branch of mental health treatment to foster compassion, empowerment, and connection to address our collective challenges. These groups integrate concepts from Joanna Macy's work that Reconnects with his group, Psychotherapeutic Skills. After completing his psychiatry residency at the University of Toronto in 2016, he studied at the Earthship Academy. He finished a Permaculture Design Certificate at the Living Center in 2018 and completed a work that Reconnects Facilitator training in 2023 and 24. Dr. Charach graduated from Dennis Windego's first training cohort for land-based focusing-oriented therapy, the first Indigenous-led evidence-based psychotherapy. He nurtures his inspiration from his Paw Paw trees in his backyard edible forest garden. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Charach.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the warm welcome. And as I was thinking about what I'm trying to offer today, was thinking about the way in which the times that we're living in and how our story of what's going on really matters, right? And so today I'm going to tell you my story of entering into the realm of where Indigenous wisdom reshapes evidence psychotherapy that can help to heal our planet, and doing this through healing our land-based trauma. And so I trained as a traditional psychiatrist, but I've also had sort of other concerns about the climate crisis and so forth, living in parallel to my concerns. And it wasn't until I started engaging in some of the learnings of Indigenous wisdoms that things have really shifted for me. And so I've almost started to develop tracking skills, as it were, trying to read what's happening and which way the winds blow me. So that's where I've shifted away from the traditional mental health system towards trying to run these collective healing kinds of groups. If you want to go to the next slide. I had initially prepared a land acknowledgement. I think you already covered a reasonable land acknowledgement. The only thing that I want to just sort of add from my own perspective is that psychiatry and my own ancestors and psychiatry also have played into some of the trauma for what's happened for the Indigenous people, and that this continues to weigh on me. And I've, rather than avoiding that acknowledgement, really leaned into it to say, okay, then how can I be part of the reconciliation that's necessary here? And how could I turn to some of the original and sacred instructions, authentically, not appropriating, but actually listening and engaging in a way that Indigenous people would feel is a part of their healing as well. There's the dish with one spoon covenant was mentioned earlier. There's also a 2-row wampum belt covenant. The 2 rows representing the Indigenous people's canoe and the other representing the settlers' canoe. And the original agreement at that point was that there's plenty of space for these different peoples to paddle in parallel and even help each other out as long as they stayed in their own canoes. As we have seen, that's not what happened. One could even say that for a while there had been parallel canoes between the Canada and US, and now there is a question of how much we're going in parallel versus getting in one another's way. And so I think this is another important covenant for us to be considering. Want to go to the next slide? And so my entrance into how the Indigenous wisdom could be affecting my clinical work was through this book by Richard Katz. There's a couple excerpts that were read today from his book, and it was really helpful for me to recognize how a lot of the colonial systems that Canada is steeped in also really affect a lot of the ways in which psychology has been developed and the way psychology sees the world, and the idea that things are objective, which really means that it's from the colonialist perspective, right? And so that was very helpful in my practice, just in terms of reflecting and in terms of engaging with the different kinds of clients that I was seeing, and helping to make me more effective by being aware of some of these biases. Somewhat independent to that, I ended up starting a green community in my neighborhood. The focus of the green community was really thinking about, okay, we have a lot of cement in our neighborhood. We don't have that many trees. How do we think about bringing this neighborhood back to what it would have been like? How do we make it more habitable for a lot of the native species that would have been there? And in that, we also included a land acknowledgement to the people that would have been there as well. And yet we kind of looked around the room and there weren't any Indigenous people there. And so something didn't quite feel right about how are we bringing this back without any Indigenous voices, and what are we actually then doing what we think we're hoping to do here? And this was one of the first times where then just the world offered me a path that I didn't even consider, because after having that question, I then was walking by and I saw a sign on somebody's lawn for Grandmother's Voice, which was very clearly an Indigenous organization. I knew nothing about it. And so I Googled it. I decided to send the organization an email saying that, I'm a psychiatrist, and both professionally and personally, I'm interested in learning more about what you do. And then I had a phone call very shortly thereafter from this woman named Jody, who told me that she had had a vision that I was going to approach her and that this was meant to be. And I was sort of an odd kind of, not something that I would have, but it felt right and also felt very odd because it was not from the frame of lens of how I see things. And yet, just like 2 weeks from when I made that phone call, there was this presentation from Elder Dennis Windego. If you want to flip to the next slide. And she told me, okay, you have to come, and if you've never heard of Dennis, like, you have to come, and then you will know what your path is from there. And so I was kind of like, I don't know what to make of this, but just somehow, like, even though I typically have a pretty busy schedule, it's typically hard to book 2 days off in 2 weeks time. There in my calendar, it actually was pretty free. And so I was like, okay, like, I guess this is just where I'm supposed to go next and see what happens. So I went to Dennis's 2-day conference, and in that circle, so Dennis comes from a Northern Ontario community, Nigiguns Minikaning, and he started his journey into healing, unfortunately, by his own trauma, which included going to residential school for many years. And many of his brothers and sisters were there. And even after residential school, he had many other years of alcohol and other forms of trauma, which he went through before finding his way to focusing-oriented therapy. Focusing-oriented therapy is an evidence-based psychotherapy started by Eugene Genlin, and that's what Dennis practiced for many years before realizing that he could turn it into what he now calls land-based focusing-oriented therapy. In that 2-day sort of conference that he had, one of the things that he talks about that he does with his clients is that he tells people, okay, you have your land and I have my land, and what's on your land stays on your land, and what's on my land stays on my land. And something about the way that he was speaking to his own trauma and his cultural trauma, land-based trauma. So in this context, land-based trauma, land is what we think of in terms of land of the water, the rocks. It's also the plants, it's the trees, it's the animals, it's the sun. It's also the cultural connection to the land. It's also the language that is associated. It is also all of the rituals that come with it. So land carries a number of things to it. And the Indigenous people, it's still pretty recent in their ancestral history that they were connected to their land. And only within the last few hundred years that there's been that disconnection. And so it is very obvious to them about how big of a trauma this is. And so that's why he's calling it land-based focusing-oriented therapy. But as he was speaking about having the client having their land and him being on his own land base, this brought up something to me that was extremely unexpected. I ended up having visions of my ancestors being driven off their land. And I didn't know about this really. I don't even know how long ago it was. And I was in this state that he actually had to come and he helped guide me through it. But it allowed me to see that, in fact, probably most, if not all of us, have ancestral land-based trauma where things were severed for us, where we all at one point were indigenous to some place, and he says this, he says, we are all indigenous to somewhere. So at some point in our history, we could name all of the plants and all of the animals. We would know how to find our food. We would know how to take only what we needed. We would know how to be in a right relation. But at some point in our lineage, for each of us, and that may be more recent or maybe further back, depending, something shifted. And when I realized that about myself, and then about the fact that it's probably not only me that this applies to, that really helped me to understand how we can be treating the world the way that we are. We are so disconnected from it that we don't treat it like another being. We treat it as though it's a resource to be extracted from. We treat it as though we can just do whatever we want and it doesn't matter how it feels about it. And so that really helped me to see how healing this land-based trauma is actually also a route to healing all the conflicts in our world. That if all of us did that, then in fact the collective would also heal too. The other piece that is central to his teachings are the fact that I am land, I am medicine, meaning that this distinction that the Western ideas make that people are separate from nature somehow is really untrue. Um, and that in fact, we are the land and we are the medicine and it is inside of us. And he says, you know, you can take a person away from their land, but you can't take the land out of them. And so the route to healing is always from the land. And so even if you aren't on your original land, you can still find that healing from within you. And that really guides his processes. And I found it to be surprisingly true and surprisingly um, counter to a lot of what I was trained in traditional Western psychotherapy. And so his approach, I find, actually has all of the things that I value in Western psychotherapy, and yet also so much more. And the way that he describes it is that focusing oriented therapy is kind of like a diving board, and then the pool that you dive into is the land-based focusing oriented therapy. Next slide, please. So then just to highlight some of the things that I find are kind of different about this way of doing therapy. Actually, let's go to the next slide. There is a value to spirituality through the connection to Earth and all of its inhabitants that is entirely absent from Western psychotherapy. Western psychotherapy kind of views the person as the pathology, they're the problem, and we just need to sort of figure things out through their mind to improve, to fix them, right? Whereas his stance is that we are part of an interconnected web, and if we are traumatized, we have some kind of disconnection from either from ourselves, from others, depending on what that trauma was. And so, in fact, we need to be reconnecting with our whole being to feel whole again. He values a connection to participants' ancestors, so the understanding of intergenerational trauma, how trauma can be passed down from generation to generation. I mean, this is actually well known in Western medicine in a different kind of way. We talk about epigenetics being passed down. So if something happens where you're traumatized, then it can change your genetic expression. And that change in the expression can, in fact, also be passed down. And that's how intergenerational trauma can be passed on. And so honoring that maybe the trauma isn't in my lifetime, maybe not even in my parents' lifetime, but it could be somewhere down the ancestral line, but actually still impacting me today. His way of viewing the healing process also is very much more about letting the body be the director in terms of where the trauma is that needs to be released. This is actually also in keeping with a fair amount of Western psychotherapy that is recognizing how somatics plays a role and how, I think it's Vessel Vanderkolk who talks about the body holds the score, where we know that trauma is held in the body. And Dennis's way of doing things really allows the body to be the leader here. It views the therapist as the guide rather than as being in charge of the healing, and that it's actually the client who's going to end up healing themselves with the help of the guide. And it assumes that the wisdom comes from within rather than it being advice from the therapist. And the more that I have really found whenever I'm engaging with people, if something is not working, it's because I'm trying to offer advice rather than trying to actually be curious to hear what's coming from them. It also allows for whatever culture a person comes from to be legitimate. He even talks about how all Indigenous people are not the same, but there's so many varieties of Indigenous people, and there's so many varieties of other people that whatever beliefs you want to hold and come in with, those don't need to change. And he also really respects autonomy in a way that Western psychotherapy doesn't, in that people do not have to share their traumatic stories. They do have to be able to go to them in certain kinds of ways and access them in certain kinds of ways, but they never need to share it with the therapist. It's their entire right not to. And that, in fact, forcing somebody to do that could, in fact, be re traumatizing. And so instead, people can heal themselves sharing as much or as little as they would like to do. As was mentioned in Dr. Katz's book, he also views health and healing as more than just not being sick. So certainly there are many people that are suffering from PTSD and other kinds of trauma-based challenges, but that just being not sick is not the same thing as actualizing into your fullest self. And his process has that spectrum where it can start from the really sick, but actually also offer the self-actualization. And it allows the person who's gone through trauma to feel that all that has happened actually has been in the service of gaining wisdom in the end. And so many people, when they're in a state of post-traumatic stress, are often wishing that that trauma hadn't happened. But if you've been able to get to a place of post-traumatic growth, although the way that you got there maybe wasn't pleasant, you can at least say, well, you know, I am the person I am today because I made it through and because I've learned what I learned. And so that's the way in which where he wants us to get at the end. And finally, he views the symptoms that come out when we're in a state of post-traumatic stress and when we're feeling dysregulated or whatever it is as symptoms, not as diagnoses or causes. Like the DSM will try to categorize things and then say, oh, you have this cluster of symptoms, therefore you have depression. And talk about that as though depression is a cause of something, when the root of that depression actually still hasn't been explained even in that narrative. And his preference is to be able to treat the root cause of things, which almost always leads back to some kind of trauma, whether it is in this life or whether it is in ancestral life. And that through healing the trauma, the symptoms tend to resolve. He doesn't he advocates that he recognizes that Western medicine still has values as well, and for example, medication. Some people still benefit from medication, and his point is that medication is also from the land, right? So it's not to totally throw out all that Western medicine has to offer. It's more about thinking about that two-row wampum belt, that this is one way of looking at it, and there's another way of looking at it, and that there's truth in both of those canoes. And so this way though has really transformed what I do. I in my own regular individual practice that I do, I actually no longer even remember what I did before I went into his training, even though it was only a year ago. It's just been so profoundly helpful in terms of recognizing that there's a much greater way of seeing what's happening in our world. So I think that's about as much time as I was supposed to spend. I could probably go on for a long time, but I did have that question of where is your land that might be useful as a take-home consideration. Where is your land? Where do you feel connected to? Because one of the things about sort of trying to reclaim indigeneity, as it were, is to sort of like I don't actually have a place I could go back to, right? And he doesn't say like, oh, you should be going back to wherever you came from. His response is like, many of us are all disconnected from land, and so we have to re-engage with the land that's here. And so what is your land? Where is your land? Start to know those who are around you in your land, which aren't just the people, but the other beings who are here too. So thank you.
Become a sustaining champion of West Hill United's work by committing to an automatic monthly donation. Learn more or donate now through Canada Helps.